Welcome to this explainer. Imagine if you went to sleep tonight and while you were dreaming, the entire map of Europe just redrew itself. We're so used to thinking about climate change as this incredibly slow, creeping process, right? But today, we're going to flip that on its head. We're walking through a really fascinating and honestly pretty terrifying thought experiment. What if geography itself literally hit the reset button in a single night? Picture waking up tomorrow morning to a reality where every single map on your phone, every border you ever learned in school, every flight route is just instantly outdated. Imagine stepping outside and the sea has swallowed low-lying land, major rivers have already burst their banks, and entirely new heat zones have locked into place across the continent. It's a world where overnight change becomes the most shocking thing you could possibly imagine. You see, we usually lean on the comfort of slow change. We expect to plan for rising seas over decades or shifting weather patterns over generations. But if that timeline shatters overnight, we're staring down the terrifying arrival of ultimate consequences all at once. In this scenario, Europe doesn't get the luxury of adapting step by step. There's zero planning phase. Those first few hours are dominated entirely by pure instant confusion as millions of people stare at immediate floods in cracked fields, asking how the heck this could happen so incredibly fast. Which brings us to part one, Europe's redrawn map, a geographical tour of the shock. Let's look at the physical reality here, starting with the most visible devastation, our coastlines. The scale of this is absolutely staggering. Europe has thousands of miles of shoreline. Suddenly, coastal flooding isn't just a push alert on your weather app. It's a massive, unstoppable intrusion. Roads vanishing underwater. Critical ports immediately damaged. We're talking about a scenario where the sea levels that were supposed to creep up for decades finally cross the threshold in one dramatic surge, turning familiar streets into rushing channels. Think about the specific regions in immediate danger. For the Dutch, who are historical masters of water management, their legendary dikes and pumps would face ultimate failure under that kind of extreme stress. And it's not just them. Northern Germany is flooded, Italy's fragile lagoon zones are submerged, and the coasts of France and the UK are inundated instantly. In this redrawn Europe, flood defenses literally become the front lines of civilization. And honestly, the hardest psychological blow wouldn't just be the flooding itself. It would be the sudden realization that they can no longer defend all the land. The question instantly shifts from will we defend it to how much can we realistically save? Now, if we shift south to the Mediterranean, extreme temperature spikes would turn already warm summers in places like Spain, Italy, and Greece into incredibly dangerous survival conditions. Soil moisture would just vanish overnight. Severe water restrictions would have to kick in instantly. The heat wouldn't just be uncomfortable anymore, it becomes a literal weapon, pushing entire regions way beyond normal human comfort and survivability unless they have immediate emergency cooling. And that leads to a horrifying new reality for those southern forests. They instantly become pure fuel. The fire season would no longer be a season, it would be a permanent threat. Beautiful, scenic hills that have held centuries-old villages and vineyards suddenly turn into highly combustible fire corridors. Plus, it's not just the flames. The smoke would choke the skies across international borders, turning air quality into a massive, immediate public health crisis. There's no off-season for wildfires anymore. The threat is just constant. Up in the mountains, the landscape totally transforms too. These high places instantly lose their role as reliable climate buffers. We'd see rapidly shrinking mountain snowpacks and retreating glaciers. Remember, water stored in ice is supposed to release slowly across the seasons, acting like a natural regulator. But in our overnight shock, that system just vanishes. It completely upends seasonal water supplies, leaving downstream river systems, hydropower grids, and crucial agriculture incredibly unstable. Because at the end of the day, glaciers are not just frozen scenery. They're part of a long-term water machine. When that machine breaks down overnight, the effects ripple through absolutely everything. Sure, ski resorts lose their economic base, but more importantly, the river systems fed by that glacier melt become wildly unpredictable. The mountains stop being a reliable buffer, becoming a glaring signal that the continent's natural storage systems have fundamentally, irrevocably broken. Moving into part two, the stacked crisis, systems pushed to the brink. Now, we hit the climax of this disaster, where Europe is facing multiple interconnected failures all at exactly the same time. Take agriculture. Europe feeds itself through a really complex mix of climate stability and trade. Overnight, that entire system gets hit from all sides simultaneously. You've got destroyed harvests in flooded zones, cracked soil and massive water shortages in drought zones, and unpredictable frosts in areas that used to be totally safe. Planting schedules? Completely ruined. This would severely tighten supply chains and drive up food prices instantly, while governments scramble just to produce staple crops to prevent outright panic. And that right there is what we call a stacked crisis. It's when multiple, simultaneous extreme weather events just overwhelm the interconnected infrastructure. Because Europe is so tightly knit, a failure in one area cascades into another incredibly fast. Floods in one country happen at the exact same time as a historic heat wave next door. Emergency services are stretched completely beyond capacity. A stressed power grid or a disrupted rail system at a major hub creates these massive ripple effects, paralyzing airports, bridges, and tunnels across the entire continent. This brings us to part 3, redrawing populations, the human and political toll. Let's step back from the infrastructure for a second and think about the families. When homes flood or forests burn, people don't just sit still, they move. Internal migration on a massive scale would begin almost immediately. Families would flee the coastlines for higher ground or escape those fire zones looking for cooler, safer areas. This sudden, massive movement puts unprecedented pressure on the destination cities. Schools, hospitals, housing markets, they'd all be completely overwhelmed, which would severely test the open borders of the Schengen system as millions of people seek safety overnight. This sets up a truly fascinating and kind of tragic collision. Historic cities like Venice, Amsterdam, and Hamburg, they were built with ancient stone layouts for a completely different climate, a completely different era. Overnight, they collide with the absolute urgency of their future. These stable, beautiful, historic centers suddenly become dangerous urban heat islands or immediate flood zones. They're forced to implement massive, immediate adaptation measures just to remain habitable. Politically speaking, the European Union would face its ultimate stress test. Climate shocks simply do not respect political borders. If one country floods, its neighbors have to absorb refugees and share food. But naturally, governments are going to scramble with differing priorities. Some might focus entirely on domestic disaster relief, while others might prioritize hard border protection. The real burning question here is, can solidarity actually hold when absolutely everyone is under extreme pressure at the exact same time? Finally, part 4, a continent accelerated, reinvention and resilience. Because despite all of this, humans are incredibly resilient. The absolute best of Europe would inevitably emerge to rebuild. If the continent survives the immediate crisis, it's going to move forcefully through 4 distinct phases: shock, triage, adaptation, and redesign. After that initial shock and the desperate triage of saving lives, we immediately hit adaptation and redesign. This overnight disaster would essentially force innovation at a breakneck pace that peacetime politics almost never manages. From neighbors helping neighbors to engineers improvising emergency cooling centers, society would rapidly accelerate into a totally new era of survival and progress. The continent would fundamentally redesign itself around some very specific pillars. We'd see way stronger coastal defenses, climate-proof cities and architecture, huge investments in AI-driven climate modeling, smart water recycling networks, and decentralized renewable grids that can't just be knocked out by a single storm. Yes, the physical landscape changes, but so does the psychological identity of Europe. People would finally understand that climate is no longer just background scenery. It's the infrastructure itself. It literally becomes the ground under every single decision a society makes. So can humanity choose the future before the future chooses for us? I'm going to leave you with that haunting question to reflect on. This entire explainer, this whole thought experiment about an overnight shock, shows us exactly why we have to act today. It asks whether we can adapt and cooperate before a crisis turns into an outright collapse. The future is coming. The only question is if we're going to be the ones who choose it. Thanks for joining me on this journey, and I hope it gave you a powerful new perspective on the world we're building.